You don't need to follow this. It continues on its own. Currents move, air shifts, systems adjust. Without instruction, without effort, you are already inside it. Nothing needs to be held. You can let it continue. Citizen, you have reached the extended rest cycle. Tonight's archive is continuous. Multiple records have been combined into a single transmission, not as separate events, but as a unified system. Ocean currents, atmospheric fields, cloud formations, different expressions of the same condition. Movement without urgency, change without disruption. There is no need to follow the transitions. They will occur without you. You may remain. The archive will continue. Rest now. You do not need to move. The water is already moving. You are in the water. These are the only facts required. This is the first thing the ocean teaches, and it teaches it before the mind has a chance to form a question. Direction already exists. It exists in the medium you are in. It does not require you to create it or find it or maintain it. You simply need to be in the water, and the water will carry you in the direction it is already going. Not drifting, being carried. The distinction is in the direction. Drifting implies a loss of direction, a passivity that is also a kind of failure, the thing that happens when no force is acting. Being carried means the direction is already established and real, and you are inside it. The current is not taking you somewhere random. It is going where it has been going, continuously, for longer than anything that has ever lived in the ocean. You are in that. The ocean of old Earth moved in currents, patterns of motion embedded in the water that were as structural as the basin the ocean filled. Not events that happened and then stopped. Not the kind of motion that requires a source and runs out when the source is spent. The currents were the permanent state of the ocean. They were what the ocean was, not what the ocean occasionally did, but the ongoing condition of the ocean. The water was always in them. And they were invisible. You could not see a current from above the water. The surface gave nothing away. The color of the water was the color of the sky reflected, not the color of what moved below. The texture of the surface, where wind was absent, was uniform. The current was not a mark on the water, it was a motion in it. The body in that water felt it differently than the eye could see it. A subtle pressure that was not pressure, a directional quality to the medium, a sense that the water had a preference, a warmth that was not the warmth of sun on skin, but something carried in the water itself, heat that had traveled with the current from a warmer latitude, that had been in the water long enough to be the water's temperature rather than an addition to it, a sense of going without any sensation of effort. The direction exists before you. You do not need to begin. You are already in motion. The surface currents of old Earth began where the sun was most direct. In the tropics, in the wide equatorial band where the sun arrived overhead rather than at an angle, where the ocean absorbed more energy per square meter than it could radiate back, the water accumulated heat. Not indefinitely. The excess moved. The physics of the system required it. The Gulf Stream was the largest and most studied of the surface currents. It began in the Gulf of Mexico. The shallow, warm, enclosed water of the Gulf absorbed solar energy at a rate that exceeded what the basin could hold, and the overflow moved northward through the Florida Strait along the eastern margin of the North American continent. Not fast in any absolute sense, but fast by the standard of ocean water. At its core, it moved at approximately 2 meters per second, faster than walking, far slower than any land vehicle, unmeasurable as speed to a body inside it. It was not a river. Calling it a river was a convenience, a way of giving the mind something to hold, direction, flow, coherence, persistence. But a river is bounded by land. The banks of a river are what make it a river, the solid border that defines the path and holds the water to it. Remove the banks and the river ceases to be a river. It becomes a tendency in the water, a preference, a direction the water has without anything to hold it there except its own properties. The current had no banks. It was defined entirely from within, warmer than the Atlantic to its right, moving where the water around it was not, rotating over hundreds of kilometers with the deflection of the Earth's spin, the same Coriolis effect that curved every moving thing on the planet's surface, pressing the current slightly away from a straight line, bending it east across the open Atlantic as it moved north. The current curved because the planet turned. The planet turned because it had been turning since before any ocean existed. The current followed. The boundary of the current was a temperature gradient, a place where warm became less warm across a few hundred meters of horizontal distance. Not a wall, not a line. A tendency in the water to be one thing, and then gradually another, and then different enough that a body in the water would know it had moved from one into the other. A river inside the ocean. The banks were made of temperature. The edge of the Gulf Stream was one of the sharpest temperature boundaries in the ocean. Oceanographers called it a front, a narrow zone where two water masses with different temperatures met, and the difference between them was more abrupt than gradual mixing would produce. At the edge of the Gulf Stream, the change was measurable in meters. 3 degrees, 4 degrees. 5 across a horizontal distance you could cross with a few strokes. The body in the water feels this. On the warm side, the temperature of the current, which had traveled from the Gulf of Mexico carrying the accumulated heat of the tropics. Not hot, not uncomfortable, but warm in the specific way that water warmed by distance is warm. A fullness to it, a quality. The water feels like it has arrived from somewhere, as if the warmth inside it has been carried a long way and arrived still intact. Cross the line. The cold arrives without transition. Not the cold of wind or shade, the cold of a different body of water, water that has been at this latitude for a different amount of time under different conditions. the warmth simply ends. The skin registers not a new sensation, but the absence of the previous one. And the boundary of the body becomes present again. The edge of the skin more specifically a fact, the warmth inside it more deliberately maintained against an outside that is no longer cooperative. Nothing visible changed. The surface looks the same. The sky is the same sky. But you crossed something with physical dimensions, a definite location, a temperature difference the body registers as an event. The line was there all along, invisible to everything except the body inside it. This is what it means to be in a system with gradients. The differences are real. They are experienced, not observed. The body encounters them not as data about a thing, but as the thing itself delivered through the skin. The line between warm and cold is not an idea. It is a location. It is somewhere you are, and then somewhere you were. The surface currents carried heat. Not as metaphor, not as analogy for something else. Thermal energy, stored in the water, transported by the current across thousands of kilometers of ocean, released at the destination. The tropics receive more solar energy than they can hold. The poles receive less. Left alone, the difference would grow. The tropics hotter, the poles colder, until the extremes exceeded what anything could sustain. The currents do not solve this. They move it. The excess heat of the tropics is loaded into warm surface water and carried poleward, and the poleward atmosphere receives what the tropics sent, and the tropics cool slightly by having given it, and the poles warm slightly by receiving it, and the difference is maintained within the range the system can sustain. The current is not trying to warm anywhere. It is going where the physics sends it. The warming it produces is a consequence, not a purpose. The system does not have a purpose. It has a state, and the state has consequences. The temperature of a coastline, the navigability of a stretch of ocean, the habitability of a latitude that would otherwise be colder. None of it planned. All of it produced by a circulation that has been running since the ocean last settled into this basin. Western Europe was warmer than its latitude should have allowed, warmer than the same latitudes on the western shore of the Atlantic, on the coast of Canada, where no current brought tropical water close enough to release its heat into the atmosphere. The same sun, the same latitude. Different temperature, because different water arrived offshore. The heat that kept those winters moderate had left the Gulf of Mexico months before. It traveled the length of the Atlantic to deliver itself. The system that moves heat across a planet's surface requires no awareness of what it is doing. It simply moves. And the world is different because it moves. The temperature of a coastline, the range of a species, the timing of a season in a place far from the tropics that the current reaches without knowing it is reaching it. All of it, the consequence of water moving in the direction the conditions allowed. This is what large systems produce. Conditions. Not outcomes they are trying to achieve, but conditions that emerge from the continuous interaction of their components. The system produces the conditions. The conditions produce the life. The life does not know the system. The system does not know the life. Both continue regardless. You are inside the side effects of a system that has no knowledge of itself. The warm water moves north, and the north cools it. This is where the system turns. Surface circulation becoming deep circulation. The water that was carried poleward beginning its long descent. In the Norwegian Sea, in the Labrador Sea, in the waters around Greenland, the warm surface water arriving from the south meets an atmosphere that in winter is very cold. The water is still warmer than the air. The difference causes transfer. Heat moves from warmer to colder. It does not need a mechanism or an initiating event. It is what happens when warm water is in contact with cold air. The direction of the transfer is not a decision. It is the consequence of the difference, and it proceeds at the rate the difference allows. The water releases what it carried from the tropics. As it cools, it becomes heavier. This is what cold water does. It wants depth. The cooling surface water in the North Atlantic presses progressively downward as it gives up its heat to the winter atmosphere. It sits at the surface, becoming heavier, not all at once, but continuously, the water cooling at the boundary with the air, and the cooled water beginning to press into the warmer, lighter water below it. Salt adds to this. Through the long transit from the tropics, some of the water evaporated. The freshwater portion carried away as vapor into the atmosphere. The salt stayed. The water that arrives in the North Atlantic is slightly saltier than it was when it left the Gulf of Mexico, slightly saltier than the water at this latitude that has not made that transit. Salt makes seawater denser. The water arriving at the sinking sites carries both the cold of the northern atmosphere and the salt of the tropics it passed through. Two forces compounding into density, both pushing in the same direction. And at a certain threshold, it descends. Not dramatically. There is no cascade, no visible event. The dense water that was at the surface is no longer at the surface. It has begun to move downward, slowly under its own weight, into the water below that is not yet as dense. The surface above fills in from the sides. The exchange is invisible. The mechanism produces no sound, no turbulence, no signal at the surface. This is where the deep system begins. Not with an event, with a gradient, the same continuous invisible force that drove the surface current, now operating in a different direction. The descending water does not fall. In air, descent is fast. Gravity, little resistance. The thing is down before there is time to think about it. In water, density differences are small, and the medium resists rapid movement. The descent of the thermohaline circulation is slow in a way that removes it from any ordinary register of motion. Meters per day in the fastest regions, centimeters per day in others. The water is going down. It will take months to reach the depth it is traveling toward. You would not feel the direction, but you would feel the pressure. Each meter of descent adds the weight of the water above it, not as pain, not as force in any specific direction, but as an evenness, an equivalent pressure from every direction simultaneously. The body surrounded, held, contained, not crushed, equalized. Every surface of the skin receiving the same pressure at once, which the body reads not as compression, but as an absence of asymmetry, the feeling of being inside something rather than beside it. The descent is as invisible to the body as the descent of a year through time, real, measurable, happening at every moment, imperceptible from inside. The descending water carries everything with it. Its temperature, the temperature of the surface conditions at the moment it went under, a temperature that is already different from the surface temperature now and will be different again from the surface temperature when it eventually returns. Its salinity, the concentration of salt accumulated through the long transit from the tropics, concentrated slightly by evaporation by the processes of the surface. The gases it absorbed from the atmosphere, oxygen, carbon dioxide, the chemical record of the air that was in contact with it at the surface. It carries the signature of the moment it left. As it descends, it moves through water that has been at depth longer. Water with a different temperature, a different chemistry, the record of when that water went under, which may have been decades ago or centuries ago or longer. The layers of water at different depths are layers of different times. The same basin, the same ocean, stratified into a sequence of eras. Each layer the chemical record of a different surface, a different sky, a different set of conditions at the moment that water left the sunlight. You move through all of them on the way down. The water from last century, the water from 3 centuries ago, the water from 5 centuries ago, still carrying the oxygen levels of the atmosphere in a pre-industrial world, the carbon concentrations of a different era's burning, the isotopic signatures of a climate the living world above had already left behind. All of them present, all of them real, all of them still moving in the slow drift of the deep toward the region where they will eventually rise. The ocean at depth is stratified into history. Going deeper, at depth the motion continues. Not the motion of wind-driven surface currents, not the motion of the descending thermohaline water in the upper ocean. Deep motion, slow motion, the kind of motion that takes centuries to complete a single circuit of the ocean, that operates below the level at which anything experiences duration. The water that formed in the cold of the North Atlantic sinks and begins to move south along the deep floor of the Atlantic, guided by the basin's topography, by the ridges and channels and seamount ranges that direct the motion of water too dense to rise, too dense to simply stop. It moves south toward the Antarctic. At the Antarctic shelf, the coldest and densest water in the ocean forms. The water in contact with the ice of Antarctica, cooled to near freezing, made heavy by the salt concentration of Antarctic surface water, sinks to the very floor of the ocean and begins to spread. This water, Antarctic bottom water, is the densest naturally occurring seawater on Earth under the current conditions of the planet. It settles to the bottom and moves north, along the floor of the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. The floor of the entire connected ocean covered in a slow drift of the densest water, carrying the signature of the Antarctic surface, moving in the dark at the pace of centuries. The entire connected floor of the ocean in slow, cold, continuous drift, carrying the signature of the conditions that made it, in the dark, toward regions it will not reach for centuries. The deep water moves. It has been moving. There is no point at which it stops, and no point at which it arrives, only the continuing, the direction maintained. The physics of cold water in a deep basin doing what cold water in a deep basin does. The water going where it goes. Months pass, years pass, decades. The water descending today will still be moving when the season that is currently at the surface has been gone for a generation. The water that entered the deep a century ago is still in the deep, still in transit, still carrying the chemical record of its era, still moving along the floor of the ocean at the pace that cold, dense water moves along the floors of oceans, not approaching arrival, not building toward anything. Simply in the direction, at the depth, at the temperature, the deep maintains regardless of what the surface above it is doing. It is dark here. Not the dark of a night that ends, the dark of a depth that has no day, not since the water went under, which may have been before anyone alive was born, before their parents were born, before the grandparents of those parents were born. The dark is not an absence. It is the condition of the depth, as constant as the cold, as structural as the direction. The water moves through it. Decades accumulate above the deep. Centuries accumulate above the deep. The organisms living at the surface are born and die, not one generation but many, not one century but several. The seasons cycle above the deep. The ice forms in the north and retreats and forms again. The surface temperature shifts with the variations of the climate. None of this reaches the deep in any immediate sense. The deep is insulated from the surface by all the layers that separate them. What is happening at the surface now will enter the deep eventually, will arrive as a different water mass in a different century, carrying the signature of conditions that will by then be historical, but not yet, not for a very long time. Meanwhile, the deep water moves, still carrying the record of the moment it went under, still in transit, still in the direction the conditions required when the direction was established. Nothing here is trying, moves, and continues moving, and does not arrive. Nothing here moves at any rate the body would register. You would have to wait, not hours, not days, but years, to notice you had traveled. The current is real. Its velocity is real. It is operating at a time scale that removes it entirely from the experience of motion. There is no sensation of going. There is no reference to measure against. There is only the water and the direction already in it, and the slow proceeding of the direction. Like the voyage, real movement, no sensation of moving. The deep and the vessel share this, not as metaphor, as structural similarity. Both systems move at the pace the physics allows. Both carry what was sealed into them when they began. Both are proceeding toward a return that is real, that is already happening, that no one inside is required to feel in order for it to continue. The full circuit of the ocean's circulation is one loop. Not a loop in the geometric sense, a circle, a closed shape with a beginning and an end that are the same point. A loop in the sense that a weather system is a loop, a continuous connected flow in which material circulates through the same pathways, in which what goes in one direction is the same material that went in a different direction some centuries before, in which the question of beginning has no answer because the whole thing has been running long enough that origin no longer applies. Water sinks in the North Atlantic, moves south along the deep Atlantic floor, enters the deep Southern Ocean, spreads east and north into the deep Pacific and deep Indian Ocean. And there, over centuries, in specific regions where the surface layers are thin enough, where the density gradient allows it, where the wind-driven surface circulation has pushed enough water away that deep water can rise to fill the gap, the deep water slowly returns to the surface. It arrives not where it left, not even in the same ocean. Water that sank in the North Atlantic rises in the Pacific, thousands of kilometers from where it descended, carrying what it accumulated in the centuries between: the cold, the chemistry, the nutrients of the deep, back to where sunlight reaches, back into contact with the sky. It begins again. The same water, not literally the same molecules, because the ocean mixes and the boundaries between water masses blur over time, but the same system, the same loop completing its next turn. The water that is descending in the North Atlantic today will arrive at the surface of the Pacific centuries from now. The water rising in the Pacific today went under in a previous century. The loop does not end because the drivers that run it, the temperature difference between tropics and poles, the salinity contrast, the rotation of the planet, do not resolve. They continue, and the loop continues because they continue. The loop is not sustained by any effort. It is sustained by the persistence of the conditions that produce it. The sun keeps arriving at the tropics at greater intensity than at the poles. The planet keeps rotating. The ocean keeps occupying its basin. As long as these things are true, the loop runs. The loop does not need to be maintained. It needs only to be in conditions. The conditions persist. The loop persists. You are inside a loop that has no end and no beginning. That simply is. The surface currents do not move in straight lines. The rotation of the Earth deflects everything that moves horizontally across its surface: air, water, anything traveling across the planet without anchoring to the ground beneath it. In the northern hemisphere, the deflection is to the right, in the southern, to the left. This is continuous, and it shapes every current in every ocean. Over hundreds of kilometers, the deflected surface currents curve into circles. The circles are called gyres. The North Atlantic gyre is approximately the size of a continent. The Gulf Stream runs up its western edge. The North Atlantic current crosses its top, moving east. The Canary Current descends its eastern edge, carrying cooler water south. The North Atlantic Equatorial Current crosses its bottom, heading west. The water circulates. The gyre turns. It has been turning for longer than any human institution that has ever existed. At the center of the gyre, the water is nearly still. The turning of the edges creates at the center a region of convergence, water accumulating, sinking very slowly, generating at the surface a calm that is both real and strange. The Sargasso Sea occupies this center. It is the only sea on Earth with no land borders. Its borders are the currents of the gyre itself, the moving water that defines the edge of the system and holds the stillness within. What enters the Sargasso Sea does not leave easily. Nothing carries things out. The inward curl of the gyre brings things to the center and leaves them there. Floating sargassum seaweed accumulates in dense mats at the surface, found in no other ocean, carried inward by the motion of the gyre over enough time that the animals living in the Sargassum evolved specifically to live there, found nowhere else. Shaped by the particular stillness and warmth of the place the gyre made. Nothing moves. Everything is circling. The center of the largest circulation system on the surface of the Atlantic is the quietest water in the ocean. The motion that defines the system is entirely at its edges. The center is held still by the motion around it. The stillness is not passive. It is produced, the outcome of four currents pressing inward from every direction, their motion arriving from all sides, colliding at the center and resolving into calm. The calm is not what happens when the motion stops. It is what happens when motion is balanced from every direction simultaneously. Four forces pressing inward, nothing pressing out. The result is not the absence of force, but the cancellation of force, which looks the same from the inside, still water, barely moving, warm and clear, but is something entirely different in origin. What the edges cannot hold, the gyre sends to the center. Not by intention, by physics. The inward curve of each current, the same Coriolis deflection that formed the gyre, carries what it holds slightly toward the interior. Once at the center, nothing carries it back. There is no outward current, no return path from the center to the edges. The center has no outflow. What arrives stays. The Sargasso does not collect what it chose. It holds what the gyre could not carry past it. Over time, this accumulates. Not quickly. The Sargasso is not a place of rapid change. It is a place of slow consistency, of conditions that persist because the surrounding motion maintains them, of accumulation that happens at the pace of the gyre's turning. The Sargassum builds over seasons and decades. The specific warmth, the specific clarity, the specific low nutrient stillness of the place establish themselves and hold. And life responds to the holding. Not to the warmth alone, which exists in other places. Not to the clarity alone, which exists in other places. To this specific combination, warmth and stillness, and the particular chemical composition that the surrounding motion maintains at the center, in no other configuration anywhere else in the ocean. The organisms that evolved in the Sargassum are not found in the open ocean beyond it. They are found here in this specific product of this specific gyre's motion, in the place that motion made. That motion maintains. That motion will unmake only if the gyre unmakes. The center of a large system does not share the character of its edges. The edges of the North Atlantic gyre are dynamic. Temperature fronts, biological abundance, the collision of water masses pressing against each other. The center is warm, still, clear, poor in nutrients, specific in a way that the edges are not. The desert at the center of the turning. Not empty. The Sargassum is dense, the ecology deep, the conditions highly particular, but a different kind of place from what the motion at the edges suggests is possible. The gyre produces its own interior. The motion produces the stillness. The turning produces the held. The water moving through the thermohaline circulation today is old. Not in the geological sense. Old in human terms. The deep water circulating through the Pacific has been out of contact with the surface for 500 years, perhaps longer. The surface it left was the surface of a different world. Different atmospheric chemistry, different temperatures, different ships, or no ships at all in parts of the ocean too far from anywhere. The water carries none of this as memory. It carries it as chemistry. The gas concentrations of its era are in it. The isotopic ratios, the trace elements of the conditions at the surface when it formed, the oxygen content of an atmosphere that has since changed. Scientists learned to read these signatures and calculate when the water was last at the surface, what conditions it formed under, how long it has been in the dark. The water does not know what it carries. It simply carries. This is what it means for a system to remember without experiencing. The record is in the material, not chosen, not curated, simply retained because the conditions of the deep prevented the chemistry of change from proceeding. The same principle the Arctic ice demonstrated, but in liquid form, moving, carrying its record across an ocean floor in the dark for centuries. The record travels with the system without the system having to maintain it. The system maintains its state, its temperature gradients, its salinity contrasts, its density differences, and the water circulates through that state without the system ever needing to know itself. The loop runs because the conditions that run it continue. The direction is a property of the conditions. The water inherits the direction. The direction was there before any particular water entered the system and will be there after it has moved through. There is no first drop. There is no origin. The loop has been running since the ocean settled into this basin, and before that it ran differently in different basins when the continents were different shapes and the ocean had different boundaries, and the circulation found the paths those boundaries allowed. The system finds its path. It always finds a path. The path changes when the conditions change. While the conditions hold, the path holds, and the water in the path goes where the path goes. You are in a system without a beginning, moving in a direction you did not create, going where the system is going. The current moves more than water. Carbon dissolves in cold water more readily than in warm. When the surface water of the North Atlantic cools and descends, it carries dissolved carbon into the deep ocean, where it will remain for the centuries of the thermohaline circuit. The ocean is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere continuously, at the rate the circulation and the biology and the temperature allow, storing it in the deep where the conditions do not allow it to return quickly. Oxygen travels the same path. The surface ocean, in contact with the atmosphere, absorbs oxygen and carries it down with the descending thermohaline water. The deep ocean breathes through the circulation, inhaling at the surface and delivering oxygen to depths where no light reaches, where no photosynthesis occurs, where living things depend on what the circulation sent down from the surface centuries before. The breath of the ocean is centuries long. Nutrients follow. The biological organisms at the surface take up nutrients, build themselves, die, sink. Their remains carry phosphorus and nitrogen and iron into the deep, where the chemistry of decomposition releases them slowly into the surrounding water. The circulation carries these nutrients through the deep pathways and eventually returns them to the surface in upwelling regions, where they feed the blooms that feed the chains that feed everything above them. The surface is fertile because of what the deep sent up. The deep is oxygenated because of what the surface sent down. There is no part of the ocean that sustains itself. Every part depends on what the rest of the system provides, what came from somewhere else, what has been traveling toward this place for decades or centuries, what will arrive when the current delivers it. The coral reef depends on nutrients carried by currents from thousands of kilometers away. The deep sea organism depends on oxygen that descended from the surface in a previous century. The tropical surface depends on the deep water that will upwell here and feed the next bloom. Nothing in the ocean stays where it starts. Everything passes through the whole system before it arrives anywhere. The ocean is not a set of places, it is a set of pathways. Everything in it is already in motion towards somewhere else. The deep water returns. In specific regions, in the Pacific, along the equator, along coasts where the wind drives surface water away and deep water rises to fill the space, the thermohaline water completes its ascent. Not dramatically. The upwelling is the mirror of the descent, slow, invisible, continuous. The surface shows nothing. The water arrives from below at the rate the surface water moved away. It arrives cold. Cold in the way that the deep ocean is cold, not the cold of a winter day, but the cold of depth, of having been far from sunlight for centuries. It carries everything it accumulated in the dark, the nutrients, the biology of the surface used up, and the deep has spent centuries concentrating, the oxygen loaded at the surface in a previous era, the chemical signatures of the conditions when it descended. The most productive surfaces in the ocean are where upwelling is strongest. Not because upwelling brings warmth, the upwelling water is cold, because it brings what the surface can no longer produce for itself, the fertility of the deep accumulated in the dark over centuries of slow transit. The cold water arrives and the surface blooms. Green in the satellite images of upwelling zones, the color of biological abundance, fed by what spent centuries in the dark on its way back. The cold arrives before the light reaches it. For a moment, the upwelling water is at the surface, but still cold, still carrying the temperature of depth, still dense, still the water it was in the dark. The sun will warm it, the surface currents will take it, the evaporation will begin. But for a moment, it is cold water at the surface, arriving from below, completing a circuit that began in a century that is gone. Nothing was diminished in the time away. The water returns carrying what it was given. The loop does not consume what moves through it, it carries. And what it carries arrives at the surface in the condition the deep preserved, cold, dense, rich, ready to become part of the surface again, ready to be warmed and evaporated and carried poleward and cooled and sent under again. The return is not the end. It is the beginning of the next circuit. Return now to the body, to the chamber, to the dark, to the particular stillness of the space you are in, which is not the stillness of the deep ocean, which moves, but the stillness of a vessel in transit, which is also moving, which has also been moving since before you entered it. The ocean covered more than 70% of the surface of old Earth. Not as approximation. As fact of the basin, the shape of the land that was above the water defined the shape of the water which covered the rest. 70% of the only surface there was. The land was the exception. The ocean was the condition. And the ocean moved continuously at every depth and every latitude, not at the same rate or in the same direction or on the same time scale. The surface moved on the scale of days and years. The deep moved on the scale of centuries. The gyres turned on the scale of decades. The thermohaline loop completed on the scale of 1,000 years. All of them simultaneous. All of them the same water, participating in each scale and sequence as it moved from surface to deep to surface again. You are in motion now. Not the motion of the ocean, the motion of the voyage, happening at a pace below the ordinary register of movement, at a pace that does not feel like motion from inside, that does not announce itself to any sense the body uses to track change. But the direction is established. It was established before you entered the cryo chamber. It exists in the physics of the mission, in the accumulated velocity, in the orientation of the vessel, in the distance growing between origin and the distance slowly closing toward destination. The direction does not require your awareness to continue. It requires only that you remain in the system that is carrying you, which you are. The Gulf Stream does not know it is the Gulf Stream. The water moving through the thermohaline circulation does not know it is completing a loop. It moves in the direction the conditions allow, in the direction the temperature and the salinity and the shape of the basin and the rotation of the planet require. And the direction is a property of the conditions, not of the water. The water inherits it. The direction was there before the water arrived and will be there after the water has moved through. You inherited the direction. The current does not require you to understand it. The water in the Gulf Stream does not know it is carrying tropical heat toward the European coastline, does not know that its eventual descent in the Norwegian Sea will drive the thermohaline circulation for decades. It simply moves, and where it moves, the system requires it to move, and what it carries, the system delivers. You are what the system is carrying. The deep water at the bottom of the Pacific is not waiting to return to the surface. It is not accumulating patience. It does not experience the 500 years of its transit as duration. It is simply moving at the rate the system allows, in the direction the density gradient and the basin and the current state of the circulation require. The return is not an event it's working toward. The return is where the current goes next, and the current goes there because that's what the current does. You are where the current goes next. The direction is in the medium, not in any individual drop, not in any single current or gyre or loop, in the relationship between all of it, the temperature and the salinity and the density and the rotation and the basin and the difference between tropics and poles that drives everything. The direction is a property of the conditions, and the conditions have been producing it for longer than anything alive on the planet when you left. The current is already running. You are in it. You were never outside the system. You do not need to swim. The archive record for ocean current systems is now complete for this transmission. The ocean of old Earth moved as a single connected system, warm surface currents carrying heat poleward, cooling and sinking, moving through the deep ocean at the pace of centuries, rising again in upwelling regions, completing a loop that no beginning can be assigned to and no end anticipated. The surface fertile from what the deep returned, the deep oxygenated from what the surface sent down, the gyres turning, each one enclosing at its center the stillest water in the ocean, held still by the motion surrounding it. The direction is in the system, not in any water that passes through it, in the relationship between the conditions that produce continuously the same pathways, the same loop, the same direction that has been running since the ocean settled into its current form. You are inside that logic, not the ocean, the logic. The conditions that produce circulation in systems of sufficient scale and patience produce the same structure everywhere. Direction without decision, movement without urgency, a loop that runs because the drivers that run it have not resolved and will not resolve, and the loop continues. The current does not end. It does not know it is a current. It does not know it is running or carrying or completing a loop. It simply is in the conditions, and the conditions produce the direction, and the direction continues. You do not need to be separate from what carries you. The water does not ride the current, it is the current. The warm surface water is the Gulf Stream. The cold descending water is the thermohaline circulation. The deep water moving along the floor of the Atlantic is the deep circulation. The system and the water are not two things. They are the same thing, in motion, proceeding in the direction the conditions allow. You are of the current. There was never anything else. Archive continuity stable. Transmission ongoing. All systems nominal. The subject, the cloud, a temporary suspension of water within moving air, persisting only as long as the conditions that formed it persist. A cloud is not a form that travels through the sky intact. It is a region of atmosphere that has crossed a threshold, where the air has cooled enough, where the humidity has concentrated enough, where the water vapor has condensed into droplets small enough to be held in suspension by the motion of the air around them. The cloud is not the droplets. The cloud is the condition that makes the droplets visible. Nothing here holds its shape. This is not a record of a thing that exists. It is a record of a threshold being crossed and crossed again continuously in both directions. You may rest now. The archive will do the work of the night. The air above old Earth contains water you cannot see. It has always contained water, carried as vapor, dispersed throughout the column of atmosphere, invisible. The amount any portion of air can carry depends on its temperature. Warmer air holds more. Cooler air holds less. The relationship does not change. The air is always carrying some water. It is rarely carrying as much as it could. When the air cools enough that the water it carries exceeds what it can hold, the excess condenses. It does not fall immediately. It settles onto the small particles that float everywhere in the air. Dust, salt, the fine residue of erosion and combustion, particles small enough to be carried in the same column as the moisture. The vapor finds a surface. A droplet forms, too small to see but present, where the threshold has been crossed. The droplet is too small to fall. The air moves too much to let it settle. It is carried. Enough droplets in the same region of air produce what can be seen, not a substance with an interior, not a structure with a surface. A density of droplets high enough that the light scattering off them makes the air appear white or gray. Where the droplets are dense enough, cloud. Where they thin out, clear air. The transition between cloud and not cloud is a transition between two densities of droplets. The droplets on one side of the line are no different in kind from the droplets on the other side. They are simply fewer. The cloud has no inside different from its outside. It is all threshold. What you cannot see surrounding it is the same material it is made of, water in the form it was in before and will return to after. The cloud is a visible region within an invisible system. The invisible system extends in all directions beyond the cloud's edge. Nothing here holds its shape. The shape is the current density. The density is changing. Rising air cools. Air near the surface is heated from below, warmed by contact with the ground and water that have absorbed the sun's energy. When air warms, it expands. When it expands, it becomes less dense than the air above it. The less dense air rises. As it rises, it moves into regions of lower pressure and expands further, cooling as it does. The cooling is continuous, tied to the rate of ascent. The air cools at a fixed rate for each increment of altitude gained. At some altitude, the rising air has cooled to the point where it can no longer hold all the water vapor it carries. That altitude is the cloud base. Below the cloud base, the rising air is invisible. At the cloud base, the cooling reaches the threshold and condensation begins. The droplets form and the region of air becomes visible. The underside of a cloud is level because the threshold is crossed at the same altitude across the width of the rising column. The same temperature, the same humidity, the same physical moment reached at the same height. The flat base of a cloud is a horizontal record of a threshold. The rising air does not stop at the cloud base. It continues upward, now releasing heat as condensation proceeds, which allows it to keep rising through air that is slightly cooler. The cloud builds upward from the base as long as the rising air remains warmer than the air surrounding it, as long as it is still buoyant, still motivated to rise. When the rising air cools to the temperature of the surrounding air, the upward motion stops. The cloud stops building. Or the conditions change and it continues. The cloud you would have seen standing below it did not begin when you noticed it. It began when the surface began heating the air above it, hours earlier. The process was already underway when the cloud became visible. When the cloud first appeared in the sky, it was already the product of a long process. It arrived already mid-formed. When you stopped watching, the process continued. Every cloud has a state it came from and a state it is returning to. The water in it was vapor before it was a droplet. The air it occupies was clear before the conditions crossed the threshold. The change from invisible to visible required conditions to be met. The conditions were met, and the water became visible. The threshold runs in both directions. The same change of conditions that produce the condensation can reverse it. When the air warms, when drier air mixes in from the edges, when the upward motion weakens and the column of rising air loses its supply, the droplets evaporate. The water returns to vapor. The cloud is gone, not moved somewhere else. Gone in the sense that the form is no longer present anywhere. The structure exists only while conditions allow it. The cloud is not a temporary version of a permanent form. It is not a form that would persist if conditions were more favorable. It is a form that exists precisely at a specific range of conditions and is gone outside them. There is no more stable version of a cloud. The cloud is exactly as stable as the conditions that produce it, and the conditions are always changing. A cloud forms because conditions allow it. A cloud dissolves because conditions have stopped allowing it. The interval between these two events is not a duration the cloud has. It's a duration the conditions have. The body knows something about thresholds. Stand at the edge of cold water and the threshold is obvious. The sharp line between the temperature you are used to and the temperature you are entering. The body does not decide whether to respond. It responds. Blood vessels constrict. The skin registers the change before any deliberate thought has formed about it. The body is always reading its own thresholds. Temperature at the skin, oxygen in the blood, posture against gravity. Every adjustment the body makes is a response to a threshold being approached or crossed. The body does not decide what to do. It responds to what the conditions require. The cloud responds the same way. Conditions approach the condensation threshold and the cloud forms. Conditions pull back from the threshold and the cloud dissolves. There is no deliberation. There is only the threshold and what happens when it is met. The cloud does not know how long it has been there. It exists at the current threshold and will continue to exist until the threshold changes. Long-lived or short-lived, the experience is the same. It is the current threshold, and then it is not. The threshold changes, the cloud responds, there is no lag. The edge of a cloud is not a surface. Walk into the edge of a low cloud, fog, which is cloud in contact with the ground, and there is no moment of crossing. The air becomes progressively less clear over meters, sometimes tens of meters. The distance at which objects remain visible decreases gradually. There is no line. There is no wall. The process is gradual because the boundary is gradual. A region where condensation is just sufficient to produce droplets, where the droplets are few and widely spaced, where the cloud is least committed to being a cloud. What looks like a clean edge from the outside is a region of negotiation. The boundary shifts with the conditions. When drier air moves in from one direction, the edge retreats. The region of adequate humidity pulls back. When cool, moist air replaces it, the edge advances. The region extends outward into what had been clear air a moment before. The edge is the current location of the condensation threshold, and the threshold moves with the conditions that determine it. Nothing here holds its shape. There is no stable interior. The cloud's center, where the droplet density is highest, where the visibility is lowest, where the conditions most completely support condensation, is not fixed. The center is the current location of the most favorable conditions, and the most favorable conditions move. The center of the cloud tomorrow may be the edge of the cloud today, or the clear air beyond the edge, or a different cloud entirely. The wisps at the cloud's edge form and dissolve faster than the central body. They are the cloud where the cloud is least supported. Thin extensions of the condensation region, briefly maintained, quickly return to clear air when the conditions fail to hold them. These are not the cloud fraying at its margins. They are the cloud testing the margin of its conditions. Where conditions support it, cloud. Where they don't, not cloud. The wisp was cloud as long as the conditions were adequate. The conditions became inadequate. The wisp is gone. The boundary is where the temporary nature of the cloud is most visible. The center only appears stable because its conditions are better supported. Support is not permanence. Support is a current state of the conditions. A cloud moves through the sky, and the cloud at the end of its path is not the cloud that started the path. The wind carries the conditions forward, the humidity, the temperature profile, the dynamics of the air mass. As those conditions move, they encounter new air the cloud has not yet reached. Condensation begins in this new air. The cloud extends its leading edge forward. New droplets form at the front. What forms is already dissolving. At the trailing edge, the conditions have moved on. The air that supported condensation has been carried forward, and drier or warmer air has replaced it. The droplets there are no longer being replenished. They evaporate. The trailing edge retreats. The cloud is dissolving at its rear and forming at its front simultaneously. It is not traveling intact through space the way a stone travels, displaced from one point and arriving whole at another. It is a process propagating through the atmosphere, condensing water into visibility ahead, releasing it back to invisibility behind. The water at the leading edge now was not the water at the leading edge an hour ago. The water at the leading edge an hour ago is behind the cloud now, or dispersed into the wider atmosphere, invisible. The cloud is a shape that moves through water rather than with it. A wave moves across the surface of the ocean, but the water it passes through does not travel with it. The water rises as the wave arrives and falls as the wave passes and returns to where it was. The energy propagates forward, the material does not. The cloud is similar. The conditions propagate through the atmosphere, producing visibility in the air they move through and releasing it in the air they leave behind. The water stays approximately in place, briefly visible as the conditions pass through it, invisible again after. The form moves. The substance does not. This is why a cloud you watch disappear did not go somewhere. The conditions that maintained it moved on, and the water returned to its ambient state. The cloud did not travel away. The cloud terminated in one location, while ahead of it, the propagating conditions were producing a new formation. The new formation was not the old cloud arrived somewhere else. It was a new threshold crossing in new air, sustained by the same moving system. It does not stay where it formed. What it was at origin is not what it is now. The conditions traveled forward. The shape followed the conditions. The water that constituted the cloud at its starting point was left behind as the conditions moved on, returning to vapor without record of the form it briefly inhabited. The shape in the sky is real. The shape is not a thing. It is the current expression of conditions that arrived here from elsewhere and will move on, carrying the shape forward without carrying the substance. The shape of a cloud is the shape of the forces acting on it at that moment. Where air rises fastest, the cloud towers. The updraft carries moisture upward. The cooling at altitude condenses it. The condensation releases heat, which drives further rising, and the tower builds from below at the same rate it is sheared and eroded from above. The tower is not built toward anything. It builds because the process that produces it has not yet reached its limit. Nothing here holds its shape. Where wind shears the cloud, faster air above, slower air below, the cloud stretches into a long horizontal form, the leading portions moving faster than the trailing ones, the shape drawn out by the differential. Where sinking air compresses from above, the cloud flattens into a layer, spreading horizontally because the vertical dimension has been blocked. The material that would have risen now spreading sideways instead. The cloud does not choose a shape. It takes the shape of the forces currently acting on it. A flat sheet of cloud covers the sky from horizon to horizon and appears to hold its form. It is not holding its form. Along its lower edge, vapor is condensing into new droplets at the same rate that existing droplets evaporate along its upper edge. The sheet is in continuous motion at the scale of its material. At the scale of the sky, it appears still. What appears not to move is moving at a scale you are not watching. The cloud at noon is not the cloud that was there at morning, even if the shape appears the same, even if you did not watch it change. The water is different. The droplets are different. The conditions have moved through and been replaced. What looks like one cloud seen at two moments is two formations that happen to be similar, produced by conditions that were similar at an altitude where similar conditions produce similar forms. It was always something else passing through the same shape. Some formations persist for hours, some persist for days. The stratus layer that sits over a cold ocean surface and extends for hundreds of kilometers does not dissolve in an afternoon. The conditions that maintain it, the stable air, the persistent cold at the surface, the slow large-scale flow, persist, and the layer persists with them. The valley fog that forms after a clear night may hold through the morning. It formed slowly, deepening through the night as the surface cooled and the air temperature dropped to the threshold. It will dissolve quickly when the sun warms the surface enough to push the threshold above the valley floor, the fog thinning and lifting and gone within the span of an hour. The persistence was not in the cloud. It was in the conditions. The stratus layer over the cold ocean is being maintained continuously, new droplets forming as old ones evaporate, the layer drawing moisture upward from the cold surface below, replenishing what is lost to evaporation at the top. It persists not because it is internally stable, but because the process maintaining it is continuous, and the conditions supplying it have not yet changed. What appears as a single persistent object is a continuous process of replacement. The layer at noon contains different water than the layer at dawn. The layer tomorrow will contain different water again. What persists is the process of formation, sustained by a state that has not yet ended. The layer does not accumulate a sense of its own duration. There is no interior from which time is experienced. It exists at the current conditions. If those conditions have persisted for 3 days, the layer has persisted for 3 days, but the layer does not hold that duration. The observer holds it. The cloud is the same at day 3 as at day 1, the current output of the current balance. Duration is not something the cloud accumulates. The cloud layer that has been over the ocean for 3 days is not older than the cloud layer that formed this morning. Both are the current output of current conditions. The 3-day layer has not accumulated 3 days of being. It has been produced continuously, moment by moment, by conditions that have not changed enough to end it. It is 3 days old only in the sense that the conditions that produce it have persisted for 3 days. The conditions have a history. The cloud is the condition's current output, as new as the current moment, with no more history than now. Duration is something the observer records. A cloud releases water when it cannot hold it. The droplets in a cloud are too small to fall. They are held in suspension by the turbulence of the air. The same upward and sideways motion that constitutes the cloud keeps the droplets aloft. But droplets are not fixed in size. They grow when the air around them cools further and more vapor condenses onto them. They grow when they collide with other droplets and merge. A merged droplet is larger. A larger droplet collides with more. At some size, the droplet is heavy enough that the upward motion of the air cannot support its weight. It begins to fall. This is not the cloud failing. It is the cloud at a different phase of its process. The water that reaches the ground carries no record of the cloud it formed in. It arrives as water, the same material that was vapor, then droplet, then falling droplet, collecting others on the way down, arriving at the surface with the force of what it has become. It does not bring the cloud with it. The cloud may continue after precipitation has begun. The cloud may dissolve before the rain reaches the ground. The droplets that started falling encountering dry air below the cloud base and evaporating before they arrive. The rain visible above the surface but gone before contact. Rain that evaporates before reaching the ground is not rain that failed. It is water that completed one transition and began another before the sequence finished. The cloud and the rain are separate outputs of the same conditions. Conditions that produce condensation in the upper air may or may not produce precipitation at the surface, depending on how deep the saturated column is, how large the droplets grow, how dry the air below the cloud base is. The rain happens where one part of the condition has proceeded far enough. The cloud, elsewhere in its extent, continues. The water leaving the cloud is not the cloud losing something it held. The cloud was not holding it. The conditions were. The cloud that forms tomorrow over the same ground is not the same cloud. The water in it may have been in a cloud last week. It may have spent the intervening time in the soil, in the ocean, in the tissues of something living that released it on dying. The water carries no record of where it has been. It arrives in the air as vapor, indistinguishable from vapor that has not been cloud. It condenses when conditions allow into whatever form the conditions allow at that altitude, in that air, at that time. It does not stay where it formed. The air over a given surface is not the same air that was there the day before. It arrived from elsewhere, carrying whatever water it carried, and it moved on, carrying whatever water it acquired. The clouds that formed in it formed in transit. The clouds that dissolved in it dissolved in transit. The sky above a given location is not the sky of that location. It is the sky of whatever air mass is currently passing through. Nothing here accumulates. The sky does not build a record of the forms that have moved through it. The air does not retain an impression of the shapes that condensed and dissolved in it. Each formation begins from conditions, not from history. The conditions may resemble conditions that produced clouds before, driven by the same large-scale patterns, producing cloud at the same altitude in roughly the same form. But they are not the same conditions. They are current conditions. They produce a current cloud. The cloud that was visible is gone, not stored, not preserved in a different form. Gone in the sense that the form it held is not present anywhere. What was visible is invisible again. If the sky could accumulate, if each formation left some record in the air that held it, the way a tree ring records a year of growth, then the air over a place would carry the compressed history of its weather, the shapes that had been there, the altitudes at which thresholds had been crossed, the durations of each cloud, its movement, its dissolution. This history would be invisible and unreadable, but present. The sky holds no such record. The air that passes through a place carries nothing of what it previously held. The vapor rising into condensation now carries nothing of the last time it was cloud. The sky over a given surface today is not different in any measurable way from the sky that was there 100 years ago. The same gases, the same capacity to hold moisture, the same physics of condensation and dissolution. The history of clouds above a place lives only in human records of them. Without those records, the sky does not remember them. What is invisible now does not record its former visibility. The cloud is not the weather. The cloud is what some of the weather looks like. The forces that produce clouds operate at scales no cloud makes visible. Large circulation patterns moving air from warm regions to cold and back. Moisture evaporating from ocean surfaces and carried inland across thousands of kilometers. Temperature and pressure systems that span whole ocean basins. The individual cloud is the intersection of those forces at one location at one time. The local, visible expression of processes that are not local and not visible. If you had been watching a single cloud, following its shape with attention, tracking it the way you track something you want to keep, you would have been watching it dissolve, not after you stopped watching. While you were watching, the dissolution was continuous. The watching did not slow it. The shape you held in your attention was always a fraction of a second old. You registered the current shape. The current shape was already the previous shape. The cloud had moved on by the time the image arrived. The shape you perceived as the shape was the shape from a moment ago, and that shape was already gone. The cloud in your memory is a cloud that no longer existed when you were looking at it. The cloud has no mechanism for preserving itself. It exists at the threshold, changes as the threshold changes, and when the threshold is no longer met, it is gone, not dispersed to somewhere, not transformed into a different stable form. Gone in the way that a sound is gone when it is no longer being made. The air that carried it retains no impression. What you would have seen watching carefully is something that appeared to hold its form while everything inside it exchanged. A shape that looked like a thing while being a process. Stable from a distance, in continuous motion at every scale smaller than the distance. The cloud persisted. The cloud's material did not. These are not the same thing. Aboard this vessel, the atmosphere does not change. The temperature in the space you occupy has remained within a controlled range since the voyage began. 214 years of temperature stability, not because the environment outside is stable, but because the systems inside are designed to maintain stability independent of outside conditions. The humidity in the air you breathe is monitored and adjusted. The composition of gases is corrected. What you breathe is not what exists outside the hull. There is nothing outside the hull you could breathe. Nothing here forms and dissolves on its own. The clouds above old Earth formed when conditions crossed a threshold. They dissolved when conditions fell back. The threshold was not maintained by anything. It was met when the physics aligned, temperature, humidity, motion, particles to condense on, and it was crossed back when the physics changed. The cloud existed because a set of conditions coincided, not because anything was holding them in place. The ship is not a coincidence of conditions. It is a maintained state. The systems that hold your temperature constant are running now in this moment while you rest. They ran through the last 100 years of the voyage and will run through the next 100. They do not respond to conditions outside them, because there are no conditions outside them that the interior needs to respond to. They maintain the interior condition because maintaining it is what they do, continuously without pause. Clouds persisted only while conditions allowed. You are held under conditions that are actively maintained. That distinction is not a small one. It is the difference between a form that exists at the mercy of the physics and a form that exists because the physics have been organized to prevent that mercy from becoming relevant. The cloud had no advocate. No system was running to preserve it. It was the product of circumstances that, when they ended, took the cloud with them. Your circumstances are not ending. You are not at the threshold. You are inside something that has removed the threshold from the equation. Your body is a humidity system. The air you inhale is dry relative to your interior. As it passes through the passages of the respiratory system, moisture is added to it, from the walls of the airways, from the surfaces of the bronchi, from the lining of the tissue through which the air travels. By the time the air reaches the exchange surfaces deep in the lung, it is saturated. The surface across which gases exchange must remain wet. The oxygen that crosses into the blood crosses through a film of moisture. The carbon dioxide that crosses out does the same. The exchange is not possible on a dry surface. The wetness is not incidental, it is the condition the exchange requires. Your exhaled breath carries that moisture out. What you breathe out is warmer than what you breathed in, and wetter, both dispersed into the air around you. In conditions cold enough that the exhaled air crosses the condensation threshold on contact with the cooler ambient air, your breath produces a small visible cloud, brief, dissolving within seconds. The physics is the same as the clouds above old Earth. Warm, humid air meeting cooler air, the humidity threshold crossed, water becoming visible as droplets scattering light. A cloud produced by your interior conditions meeting exterior conditions at their boundary. The cloud your breath makes is the body's small weather made briefly visible. Your body maintains its interior temperature through continuous adjustment. When the interior is too warm, blood vessels near the surface dilate. Warm blood moves closer to the skin, heat releases into the surrounding air. Sweat reaches the skin and evaporates, and the evaporation takes heat with it. The same process that drives moisture from the ocean surface into the atmosphere. The same physics, smaller, faster, local. The body cooling itself by giving water to the air, the way the ocean gives water to the air, the way the desert gives heat to the air above it. The body's interior is not variable in the way a cloud is variable. It is maintained, the range narrow, the systems continuous. But the moisture the body releases is not maintained. It disperses. It becomes part of whatever air surrounds you. It carries no record of having been inside you. No trace of the temperature it came from, the depth it rose from, the surface it crossed. Your exhaled breath is in this room. It has already dispersed. It does not know where it came from. The record is complete. The water that was suspended above old Earth, that held shape temporarily in the form of cloud, that dissolved when conditions changed, that fell as rain or returned to vapor without falling, that continued in the cycle it was always in, that water remains, not gone, not preserved, continuing. It is in the air now, or in the ocean, or in the ground, in the body of something living or recently released from one, moving through forms that do not last, driven by processes that do not pause. The ship holds you in an interval that does not move. The systems maintaining this atmosphere are operating in this moment, in the space between your heartbeats, in the interval between each breath. They are not resting. They do not have an equivalent to rest. They maintain because maintenance is continuous, because the interior condition requires continuous maintenance to remain the interior condition. What the clouds had, you have in a different form, the conditions that support you. Not produced by the coincidence of physics, but organized, sustained, guarded against the changes that would end them. What the cloud could not do, maintain its form independent of whatever conditions the atmosphere happened to be producing at that moment. This system does. The temperature you rest at now is the same temperature you have rested at for 214 years of voyage. The air you breathe has been maintained within the range the body requires, without interruption, without the interruption of changing conditions, without the gap between one favorable moment and the next. What you need to remain is being provided continuously by systems that do not tire and do not depend on the physics happening to align. You do not need to hold your shape. You are held. Rest now. The archive continues. A cloud is a temporary suspension. It forms when conditions allow. It persists while conditions allow. It dissolves when conditions stop allowing. Nothing here holds its shape. What forms is already dissolving. The structure exists only while conditions allow it. It does not stay where it formed. The water does not stop when the cloud dissolves. It returns to vapor. It moves in the air, carried with whatever air carries it, carrying no record of the form it briefly held, or the altitude at which it was visible, or the length of time it was a cloud rather than vapor. The air does not record its passage. The sky does not accumulate the history of forms that have moved through it. Nothing here accumulates. Each formation is a current formation. Each dissolution is complete. What the cloud was has no persistence in the cloud's material. The material was always exchanging, always forming at one edge and dissolving at another, the shape always the shape of the current conditions. The shape was real while the conditions held. When the conditions changed, the shape ended. The ending was not a failure. It was the conclusion of what the shape always was. The cloud did not know what it was. It had no model of its own persistence, no sense of how long it had held, no awareness of the form it was taking. What it was fully and without remainder, not holding anything back, not storing anything for later. The conditions that allowed it were the conditions that were there. Those conditions produced cloud. When they ended, the cloud ended with them. Rest is something like this. It forms under conditions, the absence of demand, the slowing of what was active, the particular warmth and position of a body that has been allowed to stop. It does not need to be constructed. It is what forms when what prevented it has been removed. It does not need to be held. It holds as long as the conditions hold it. The conditions are holding. What the cloud was is a record only in the memory of what observed it. And the observation was always a fraction of a second behind. The cloud you remember is a cloud that no longer existed when you remembered it. The sky does not know this. The sky does not remember. What was visible is invisible again. What forms is already dissolving. Archive sequence progressing. You may remain at rest. Tonight's record comes from the cold survey files of old Earth. The subject, the Arctic. The northernmost region of the planet, a place of ice and open sky, of silence that is not empty, and of cold that does not merely lower temperature but simplifies, that removes what is not necessary. That holds what remains unchanged, at depth, for as long as the cold holds. This record is preserved for the colonists aboard this vessel, for those who will one day stand at the edge of what a world permits, and need to know what cold reveals. What becomes visible when everything excess has been stripped away. You may rest now. The archive will do the work of the night. You know what cold is before the word for it. Not as information, not as temperature read from a surface. Cold is something the body carries as knowledge, the withdrawal of warmth, the tightening inward, the sharpening of the line between skin and the air that is asking for what the skin carries. The Arctic of old Earth was cold in a way that made all other cold seem temporary. Not brutally, not as a punishing force that arrives and passes, as condition. The kind of cold that does not come and go with the wind or the shade, but settles into everything evenly, continuously without relent. The kind of cold that is not weather. It is what the place is made of. Step into it, or imagine stepping into it, which in this context is the same thing, and the first thing that happens is the breath. Cold air entering the lungs is denser than warm air, more present. It announces itself in the chest with a kind of precision, a crispness that the body recognizes as, this place is real and I am inside it. The breath in the Arctic does not merely oxygenate, it orients. The lungs feel the weight of the air in a way warm air never allows, a pressure not unpleasant, an insistence on being noticed. The second thing is the face. The parts of skin left exposed, the forehead, the cheeks, the tip of the nose, register the cold as definition. The boundary of the body becomes precise. The outside and the inside are no longer vague neighbors, but clearly separated by the thin line of skin, suddenly conscious of its own function. The body's edge sharpens. What is inside is more clearly inside. The Arctic does this continuously to everything. In warmer places, boundaries blur. Humidity moves between bodies and atmosphere. Heat radiates outward, softening the distinction between warm thing and warm air. Things merge a little at their edges. In the cold, the edges clarify. What is warm is specifically, urgently warm. What is cold is exactly structurally cold. The boundary between them is where the skin is. This is not discomfort at the level the body is built to tolerate. It is a kind of clarity. The cold does not add anything. It removes. It provides conditions in which what is already present becomes more legible. The body in the cold is more precisely itself. Its warmth a more deliberate achievement. Its boundary a more conscious fact. The air is dry and clear. The horizon is visible. Sound arrives without the diffusion that humidity introduces. Light does not scatter through atmospheric moisture, but travels at low angles through clear, cold air and casts shadows that reveal texture in everything they touch. This is what the cold does. Not diminishment, simplification. What the cold removes, you do not miss until you return to where it was. In warmer environments, the world is in continuous motion. The chemistry of decomposition proceeds without pause. Organic material is broken down and reassembled into other forms. The air carries particles in every direction. The ambient processes of thousands of living things, decomposers, processors, the cycling of nutrient through soil and root and leaf, all of it continuous, all of it contributing to a richness that is also, in another sense, a kind of noise. The cold silences this. Below a certain temperature, the chemistry of return cannot proceed. What has formed stays formed. What has ended stays ended, in the shape of its ending, held in the cold without transformation. There is no excess here. What remains in the Arctic is what could not be removed, which is to say, what had been refined by conditions into the form that the conditions required. The organisms that survive do so not by fighting the simplification, but by having become, over generations, forms that the cold cannot improve on. Nothing decorative, nothing provisional, only what was required by the place in the exact form the place asked for. You recognize this principle, not from the Arctic perhaps, but from any moment when difficulty stripped away what was incidental and what remained was the core. The thing that had always been there, that did not require warmth or ease or the accumulation of excess to be exactly what it was. Cold simplifies. What the cold of the Arctic leaves is not a diminished version of what was there before. It is a clarified version. The same living world, with everything that was contingent and temporary and incidental removed from it. The summer visitors gone, the warmth-dependent processes gone, the noise of abundance gone, until what remains is the core, the structure beneath. The thing that was always there, visible now, only because everything else that obscured it has been removed. The cold of this vessel is doing something similar, not stripping, not reducing, but holding at a temperature below the threshold of unnecessary change, maintaining the form, preserving what was present at departure, while time accumulates outside the shell of the cold, and the voyage continues, and the distance grows. What was sealed at the moment of leaving remains sealed. The deep ocean trench had no horizon. In every direction at the trench floor, the same medium extended, water, pressure, permanent dark, without visible edge. Orientation was internal. The only reference was gradient, more or less of a condition in one direction or another. No surface to face, no line to aim for. The Arctic is the opposite. The surface of the ice extends flat in every direction, and the horizon sits at the edge of visibility, clear and sharp and evenly placed. A line between the white of the ground and the color of the sky above it, running all the way around, at equal distance from wherever you stand. You are at the center of a circle. The edge is the same in every direction. The horizon in the Arctic is not mountains at a distance or trees at the edge of a clearing. It is the actual limit of vision, the precise place where the curvature of the planet places the boundary between what can be seen and what is over the edge. And because the Arctic is flat, because there is nothing between you and the horizon, you see the horizon itself, the real thing, not something placed in front of it. The human body evolved with horizons. The eye is shaped for them, the long lateral field of vision, the specific way the brain processes the distance to a flat horizon as an absolute coordinate. The horizon tells the body, you are here, the edge of the visible world is there, and the distance between them is known. You are located. You are oriented. The world is organized around you at a scale you can perceive. In the Arctic, this works with unusual precision. And yet the Arctic horizon has its own strangeness. Because what you're looking at is not land, it is ice meeting sky. And the colors can match. A gray sky above gray ice, a white sky above white ice, a surface that reflects what is above it, an atmosphere that takes the color of what is below. When this happens, the line that was the absolute coordinate is still exactly where it was, but the eye cannot find it. White extends in every direction without interruption. Above and below are the same color, the same apparent distance, the same surface. The world has not changed. The horizon is still there, in the exact place it was. But for that moment, it is invisible, present and imperceptible simultaneously, which is a different kind of disorientation than the trench's total absence. The reference is there. You simply cannot see it. And then the sky shifts, or the light changes, or a shadow falls across the ice, and the line reappears, sharp and equal, exactly where it should be. It was always there. The light of the Arctic comes from the wrong angle. Even in summer, even at noon, the sun never rises high. It moves along the horizon rather than above it. Its arc through the sky is shallow and lateral, more a circle near the horizon than a climb toward overhead. The light at noon in the Arctic arrives from the same angle as the light at dawn or dusk in temperate places, low, raking, deeply horizontal. Overhead light flattens. It eliminates shadow from most surfaces, reducing the three-dimensional world to a bright, even plane. Overhead light is efficient for seeing what is present, but poor for seeing what things are made of. What texture and structure exist in the surface beneath your feet. Low-angle light does the opposite. Every variation in the surface casts a shadow. Every slight ridge in the ice, every crystal irregularity, every place where wind has sculpted the snow into a form, all of it lit from the side, all of it casting its shadow across what surrounds it. A pebble on the ice at noon casts a shadow longer than a person standing in afternoon sun at the equator. The same surface that would look flat in overhead light reveals in lateral light its entire topography. The Arctic makes visible what other light conditions hide. There is a specific blue in old compressed ice, not the blue of sky or ocean. An internal blue, deep and structural, that comes from years of compression, working the air pockets out of the crystal lattice, densifying the ice until light traveling through it encounters less air and more pure ice, and scatters differently and emerges as that color. It cannot be seen in overhead light. It requires the low-angle illumination of polar sun entering the ice from the side to travel the depth needed to produce the color. That color exists only there, not as decoration, as a record of how long the ice has been there and how much has accumulated above it and what the weight of years does to the material that holds them. You carry something equivalent, not visual, but the same principle. In conditions that flatten detail, in comfortable, even, undifferentiated warmth, the surface of things can be read as uniform. When conditions are harder, the surface reveals itself. What is underneath becomes visible in a way it was not before. The texture of what a thing is made of becomes the subject. The low light shows what the thing actually is. In Arctic summer, the sun does not set. Not it sets very late. Not the sky stays light for a long time after sunset. The sun travels its arc and reaches the place where it should drop below the horizon, and it does not drop. It continues, low and circular, moving along the horizon without descending, returning at midnight to where it was at noon, and continuing without pause. This is one of the genuinely uncanny qualities of the Arctic. Not frightening, but wrong in a particular quiet way, the wrongness of a reliable signal absent from where it always was. The body has a relationship with the setting sun that predates awareness. The withdrawal of light is a signal that lives in the cellular chemistry, in the circadian machinery older than consciousness by a very long time. When the sun goes down, something initiates, a chemical cascade that leads toward rest, toward the lowered metabolism and the deep work of sleep. This is not chosen, it is ancient. In Arctic summer, the signal does not come. Not loudly, not in a way the conscious mind would register, but somewhere in the body, below awareness, a system designed to respond to a specific cue waits. The cue does not come. The sun circles the sky at midnight, and at 2 in the morning, and at noon, still circling, still present, still not setting. The animals calibrate differently, not to daily light, but to the seasonal arc, the temperature, the availability of food, the angle of the sun rather than its presence. They use other clocks, an older kind of orientation. In the long Arctic summer, time is organized differently, not by the daily rhythm, but by what lies on either side of the year's long center. The long inhalation of light, the long exhalation of dark, the self oriented within the larger cycle, the body finding its pace inside a rhythm that does not repeat every 24 hours, but every 12 months. Rest in this image, the sun that moves along the horizon without dropping, neither committed to day nor committed to night, held at an intermediate position that does not resolve into either extreme, not confused, simply in a different relationship to the rotation of the planet. In Arctic winter, the sun does not rise. At the furthest latitudes, the sun moves below the horizon at the autumn equinox and does not return until spring. The noon sky is the color of 2 in the morning. The stars are present at midday. The world is dark without interruption, not night as an interval between days, but darkness as condition, as what the season is. The migrations leave before this arrives. The birds that fill the Arctic in summer, species that have traveled from the other end of the planet, crossing the equator twice each year, arriving in Arctic summer to breed in the long light, are gone before the dark settles. What remains is smaller, more compressed. The species that can exist through the polar night, the ones that found a way. In the clear dark nights, the aurora appears. Not predictably, not on a schedule, but in the long winter darkness, when charged particles from the sun move along the planet's magnetic field lines and collide with the upper atmosphere, light is released. Greens, and sometimes reds or blues, moving in curtains and ribbons across the sky from horizon to horizon, completely silent. Light in the sky that makes no sound. The silence of the aurora is part of what unsettles, not frightens, but notices. Something that size, that brightness, moving across the entire dome of the sky should register in the air. It does not. It moves the way a reflection moves, the way light moves on water, like something seen in a medium that does not transmit sound. Like the visible expression of a force that has no voice. It is a reminder that what shapes the world is not always loud or visible at all. The magnetic field that holds the aurora is always there. The charged particles are always arriving. The light is the moment when the invisible becomes briefly, brilliantly perceptible. Not because the field changed, but because the conditions aligned to make it readable. You are moving through your own polar night. The absence of ordinary light is not the absence of all light. Something continues to move in the dark of the voyage, not visible, but present in the way the magnetic fields are present, shaping what passes through them, orienting what can be oriented, ready to become visible when the conditions that require it arrive. The Arctic is not quiet, but what sounds it contains are clear and widely spaced, and the space between them is large enough that each arrives as an event rather than as part of a background. In warmer, more populated places, the sound environment is layered, different frequencies from different sources at different distances, the continuous ambient noise of life in large numbers. The brain filters this into background before it is consciously heard. You notice silence only when this layer is removed. In the Arctic, it is removed. What remains is very few sounds and very clear. Wind when it blows. An Arctic wind is specific, directional, with a character that distinguishes it from the ambient agitation of warmer air. The creak and pop of ice adjusting to temperature change, a sound that comes from no visible source, arrives from everywhere at once, and resolves without trace. The exhalation of an animal at close range, the specific sound of a boot on dry snow, a compression, a squeak, which is different from wet snow and announces a temperature below a certain threshold. These sounds do not blend into background, they arrive into silence as events. Nothing moves. And then something does, and you know exactly where it is, because there is nothing else to be. Sometimes it is wind, arriving without warning, moving across the flat surface in a direction without deviation, sweeping a low sheet of surface snow before it, gone in seconds. The silence returns, and the surface is slightly different from what it was, and you know what passed through it only by the trace left in the snow. Snow absorbs sound. The flat ice reflects it or carries it across great distances, but attenuated. Sounds that should be loud for their source arrive softer than expected, quieter than their distance warrants, as if the cold made them careful. A sound made a kilometer away across open ice arrives like a whisper. The Arctic silence is not the silence of absence. It is the presence of a vast space with very little in it, and the full, undistracted awareness of what that space contains. You know this quality of attention, the attention that is possible only when the background has been removed, when what arrives alone into a space large enough to hold it without competition. When there is enough silence around each event that it can be heard exactly as it is, its distance, its direction, its character, without anything else pressing into the same moment. The Arctic teaches this without intending to. What lives in the Arctic has been made exact by cold. Not abundant, exact. The Arctic fox in winter is white and compact, and still, its geometry and expression of the thermal logic that shaped it across generations. Short ears, short limbs, dense layered fur, a body that produces more heat per unit of surface area than a larger, looser form could sustain. It moves carefully. Every motion considered against the cost of making it. It navigates the snow not despite the cold, but within it, exactly as it was made to. In winter, the pregnant polar bear enters a snowdrift and disappears. She excavates a cavity and her body heat slowly enlarges the space. She remains inside for months. Her heart rate drops. Her metabolism slows. She does not eat. She does not emerge. Inside the den, in the cold and the dark and the quiet, she gives birth. The cubs are born small and alive in the insulated space she has made of herself, and she nurses them through the winter months, converting what she stored before the snow came into the heat and milk that maintains them both. She is in there now, in the drift, in the dark, doing something that looks from outside like stillness, but is the most active work she will do all year. When she emerges in spring, she will be lighter, the cubs will be larger, the snow will be melting, nothing will have been lost in the months of interior work. Below the sea ice, the water is near freezing. 28 degrees, held liquid by the salt just below the temperature at which fresh water would become ice, and in that water, the seals. Warm-blooded, 37 degrees inside, moving through near-freezing water as if it were not a continuous drain on what they carry, maintaining the temperature of a warm summer afternoon inside themselves, in the deepest cold the ocean at that latitude produces. The cold is everywhere around them. It does not reach them. They carry summer with them. Not borrowed from a warmer place, not protected against the cold by avoiding it. Made continuously from the inside, from the fat stored and the breath taken, and the metabolism of a body that produces more warmth than the cold can take. The warmth is not preserved. It is generated, continuously, without pause, through the months of dark. There is no urgency in how they move. The cold is their medium, not their difficulty. They exist inside it as the pressure was the medium of the deep ocean fish, not in spite of the condition, but in the form the condition required. What lives in the Arctic has been made exact by cold. Not abundant, exact. The Arctic fox in winter is white and compact, and still, its geometry and expression of the thermal logic that shaped it across generations. Short ears, short limbs, dense layered fur, a body that produces more heat per unit of surface area than a larger, looser form could sustain. It moves carefully. Every motion considered against the cost of making it. It navigates the snow not despite the cold, but within it, exactly as it was made to. In winter, the pregnant polar bear enters a snowdrift and disappears. She excavates a cavity and her body heat slowly enlarges the space. She remains inside for months. Her heart rate drops. Her metabolism slows. She does not eat. She does not emerge. Inside the den, in the cold and the dark and the quiet, she gives birth. The cubs are born small and alive in the insulated space she has made of herself, and she nurses them through the winter months, converting what she stored before the snow came into the heat and milk that maintains them both. She is in there now, in the drift, in the dark, doing something that looks from outside like stillness, but is the most active work she will do all year. When she emerges in spring, she will be lighter, the cubs will be larger, the snow will be melting, nothing will have been lost in the months of interior work. Below the sea ice, the water is near freezing. 28 degrees, held liquid by the salt just below the temperature at which fresh water would become ice, and in that water, the seals. Warm-blooded, 37 degrees inside, moving through near-freezing water as if it were not a continuous drain on what they carry, maintaining the temperature of a warm summer afternoon inside themselves, in the deepest cold the ocean at that latitude produces. The cold is everywhere around them. It does not reach them. They carry summer with them. not borrowed from a warmer place, not protected against the cold by avoiding it, made continuously from the inside, from the fat stored and the breath taken, and the metabolism of a body that produces more warmth than the cold can take. The warmth is not preserved, it is generated continuously, without pause, through the months of dark. There is no urgency in how they move. The cold is their medium, not their difficulty. They exist inside it as the pressure was the medium of the deep ocean fish, not in spite of the condition, but in the form the condition required. What lives in the Arctic has been made exact by cold. Not abundant, exact. The Arctic fox in winter is white and compact, and still, its geometry and expression of the thermal logic that shaped it across generations. Short ears, short limbs, dense layered fur, a body that produces more heat per unit of surface area than a larger, looser form could sustain. It moves carefully. Every motion considered against the cost of making it. It navigates the snow not despite the cold, but within it, exactly as it was made to. In winter, the pregnant polar bear enters a snowdrift and disappears. She excavates a cavity and her body heat slowly enlarges the space. She remains inside for months. Her heart rate drops. Her metabolism slows. She does not eat. She does not emerge. Inside the den, in the cold and the dark and the quiet, she gives birth. The cubs are born small and alive in the insulated space she has made of herself, and she nurses them through the winter months, converting what she stored before the snow came into the heat and milk that maintains them both. She is in there now, in the drift, in the dark, doing something that looks from outside like stillness, but is the most active work she will do all year. When she emerges in spring, she will be lighter, the cubs will be larger, the snow will be melting, nothing will have been lost in the months of interior work. Below the sea ice, the water is near freezing. 28 degrees, held liquid by the salt just below the temperature at which fresh water would become ice, and in that water, the seals. Warm-blooded, 37 degrees inside, moving through near-freezing water as if it were not a continuous drain on what they carry, maintaining the temperature of a warm summer afternoon inside themselves, in the deepest cold the ocean at that latitude produces. The cold is everywhere around them. It does not reach them. They carry summer with them. Not borrowed from a warmer place, not protected against the cold by avoiding it. Made continuously from the inside, from the fat stored and the breath taken, and the metabolism of a body that produces more warmth than the cold can take. The warmth is not preserved, it is generated continuously, without pause, through the months of dark. There is no urgency in how they move. The cold is their medium, not their difficulty. They exist inside it as the pressure was the medium of the deep ocean fish, not in spite of the condition, but in the form the condition required. In the ice, time is visible, not as metaphor, not as interpretation, as physical fact, layered and readable. Each year of snowfall leaves a layer. The winter snow differs from the summer snowmelt in density and texture, and the particles it carried down from the atmosphere. Volcanic eruptions leave a chemical signature in the layer of the year they occurred. The atmospheric chemistry of each century is recorded in what the ice sealed from the air at that time. Scientists learn to read these layers the way pages are read, not for what someone chose to write, but for what the conditions of the year required to be present. The atmosphere of the past is in there. When ice forms and traps air bubbles, it seals the air that was present at the moment of freezing. The bubbles are compressed as the ice deepens, pressed smaller by the weight of years accumulating above them, but they remain, small pockets of what the air was. The chemistry of the atmosphere at that exact moment, the concentration of gases, the particles, the signatures of what was burning and what was blooming in the world at the surface. Release the bubble, and the air that was sealed 800,000 years ago has never been outside. It has been in there, held at temperature, at depth, in the dark, since before any ancestor you could name was alive. Since before the first city was built, the first language written, the first ship made. It has been in the ice while everything that constitutes human history proceeded above it. It did not know it was being held. It did not experience the time that passed. It is identical to what it was. This is the moment worth sitting with. Not frightening, but strange in the way that the mind circles back to something that does not quite resolve. A thing sealed and held unchanged through a span of time that contains everything you can name and still exactly what it was when it went in. The ice does what the archive does, not by choosing what to preserve, but by providing conditions that prevent loss. It holds everything indiscriminately, the eruption and the calm year, the cold century and the warm one, the year the bloom was abundant and the year it failed. All of it, layer on layer, held because the cold prevented the chemistry of change from proceeding. What you carry is more like ice than archive. It holds what it holds, not because a decision was made to preserve it, but because the conditions that would change it have been suspended, not by deliberate choice, by cold, by the withdrawal of the warmth that would have moved through you and altered you into something other than what you were at departure. Open you eventually, and the air inside will be what it was. But ice is not passive. The cold that holds also stresses. As temperature drops, ice contracts, not by much, but enough. The sheet pulls against itself, and when the tension exceeds what the lattice can hold, it releases, without warning. A crack propagates across the surface at speed, less a sound than a declaration, a sharp report that travels from one edge toward the horizon and is gone before the body can locate its source. Loud, decisive, absorbed back into silence before the mind has finished registering it. The ice settles into its new configuration. The crack is not failure, it is answer, the surface solving for the new geometry the cold has required. A moment later, the silence is as complete as it was before. Nothing in the texture of the stillness suggests anything happened. But the sheet is different now, and what it holds in a new arrangement. Still holding. The permafrost holds things that warmer ground cannot. The permanently frozen layer below the Arctic surface, in some places hundreds of meters deep, in some places undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years, has preserved what would otherwise have been returned to the cycle of decomposition. The remains of organisms that lived in climates that no longer exist at those latitudes, seeds, pollen, spores, the intact stomach contents of animals whose last meal is still recognizable. A mammoth pulled from the permafrost is not a fossil. A fossil has been replaced, the original material exchanged over time for mineral deposits that hold the shape while losing the substance. The permafrost mammoth retains its original material. The tissue, the hair, the grass it last ate pressed into the preserved stomach. Not replaced, held. The difference matters. A fossil tells you the shape of what was. The permafrost material tells you the thing itself. One is a record made after the fact, the other is the fact intact. Cold does not transform what it contains. It maintains it in its current form. Time accumulates outside, the seasons pass, the climate shifts over thousands of years, the ice retreats and advances, and inside the frozen layer, what was sealed at freezing remains exactly what it was. This is what cold does to time. In warmth, time moves through things and changes them. They decay, are broken down, are reassembled into other forms. The information held in the original form is lost in the reassembly, not destroyed but distributed, scattered, transformed into something that no longer holds the original record. Warm ground remembers nothing, it transforms everything. Cold ground holds the record. The permafrost is a library without pages, the information stored in the original material itself, not in any representation of it, not described, preserved. The vessel you rest in is a different kind of cold ground. Not the same cold, not the same preservation, but the same logic, the withdrawal of the conditions that would transform, the maintenance of what was sealed at the moment the temperature dropped. When the permafrost thaws, what was held is released, intact, into the conditions that allow it to become again, to grow, to be consumed, to return to the cycles it had been removed from. The season that follows the long preservation is not diminished by what came before it. It begins from the full condition of what was preserved. There is a temperature at which water hesitates. Not frozen, not moving. The molecular motion has slowed past the point where fluidity is easy, but has not yet committed to the lattice. A disturbance will send it one direction. Stillness will hold it at the threshold. At this temperature, time seems to slow with the molecules. The chemistry of living things follows the same principle. The metabolic rate, the rate at which cells produce and consume and maintain themselves, the rate at which the body processes and repairs, is chemical, and chemical reactions slow with cold. Not just the chemistry of decay, all of it. The body at cold temperature is not absent. It is proceeding at the pace the cold allows. The same processes across more time. The Arctic hare in deepest winter is not waiting for spring. It is living at the pace of winter, breathing at the pace of winter, moving at the pace of winter, exactly where it needs to be. When spring arrives and the pace changes, nothing will have been lost in the slower months. The hare will shift into the pace of spring from the full condition of having been winter. The body adapts to the pace that the cold allows. You are in this. Not at zero, not stopped, at the pace of this depth and this cold. The biological processes that constitute you are proceeding at the rate the chamber permits. Not deficient, not absent, but different. Slower, the same work across more time. The hare in the snow does not know it is waiting. It is simply there in the cold at the pace of winter, exactly as it needs to be. Something is accumulating in the cold that cannot accumulate at the surface pace. The consolidation that requires stillness. The compression of what was given into the form that will be available when the pace changes. Not all work announces itself. The ice building one layer at a time does not announce its accumulation. The bear in the snow does not announce the work being done in the dark. What is slow enough to seem like stillness is often the deepest kind of work, the kind that only becomes readable later when conditions change and what was accumulating is finally visible in what it left behind. Return now to the feeling of cold air entering the lungs. The density of it, the way it announces itself, not as discomfort but as precision, the body made aware of its own boundary, the warmth held inside, the cold outside, the line between them clear and continuously maintained. The Arctic is the landscape of clarity. Not because it is beautiful, though it often is. Not because it is peaceful, though it often is. Because the cold removes what is not necessary, and what remains after that removal is legible. The horizon visible in every direction, sharp and equal. The light low enough to reveal texture in everything it touches. The silence spacious enough to hold each sound as a distinct event without competition. The cold honest about itself, continuous, structural, not varying to deceive or to comfort. What is there is what remains after the cold has finished. What is not there has been removed by conditions that do not make exceptions. The form of every organism that lives there is the exact form the cold required. The form of every ice crystal is the only form available. The surface of everything is the surface that the conditions have made visible. Earlier in this voyage, the archive sent a record of the ocean trenches of old Earth. The place where life exists under conditions that would destroy it anywhere else. The place where the pressure that would kill most things is what holds certain things together. Where the darkness has never been interrupted and life has built itself around that dark and become indistinguishable from it. The Arctic is a different edge. Not the edge of depth, but the edge of temperature. Not the edge of darkness, but in winter, the edge of light. Not the edge of pressure, but the edge of what cold will hold. And life at this edge is not shaped by pressure or dark, but by cold and simplification. By having been reduced through generation and generation to exactly what the place required. No less than what the place required. The polar bear in the snow is not diminished by winter. She is doing the most essential work of her life inside it. The seal is not surviving the cold. It is carrying warmth through the cold, generating it continuously from the inside, maintaining summer inside itself through the deepest winter the ocean at that latitude can produce. What the edge asks for is not less, it is exact. You are in your own kind of simplification. The voyage has not diminished what you carry. It has held it at the temperature below the threshold of unnecessary change. What was real at departure is real now. The cold has not improved on it, has not reduced it, has not transformed it into something else. It has held it in its form. The ice core pulls intact from the sheet. The air inside is what it was, not diminished by the time that passed. not different for having been held, carrying the full record of the moment it was sealed. What was preserved was not chosen, it was simply held, in cold at depth, while everything else continued. This is what you are. Not waiting in the sense of incomplete, sealed, preserved, carrying what you carry at the full fidelity of the moment of departure. The horizon is there. It was always there, whether or not the colors matched and the eye could find it. The flat horizon, equal in every direction, the external coordinate that the body evolved to read. When the conditions change, the line will reappear, sharp and clear, exactly where it should be. The light, when it comes, will be low and lateral, revealing texture, illuminating the surface of things in a way that overhead light does not, making visible what other light conditions hide. Cold reveals what is essential. What the cold has held is what will be needed. What was sealed remains, not as memory, as you. The archive record for Arctic systems is now complete for this transmission. What the Arctic held was not absence. It held simplification, the removal of everything not necessary until what remained was the thing itself in exact conditions. Ice that preserved the air of 800,000 years. Animals carrying warmth through cold that would otherwise reach them. Silence spacious enough to contain each event distinctly. A horizon visible in every direction as a fixed coordinate for a body that knows how to use one. The cold is not the opposite of life. It is the condition that shows what life is made of, that removes the incidental and holds the essential, that keeps the record intact, layer on layer, until the conditions that allow reading it arrive. Rest in it. Rest now. The archive continues. No action is required. The systems remain in motion. The conditions are stable. You may remain at rest. There is nothing to follow, nothing to complete, nothing to hold. You are already inside it.